back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome. My name is Mr. Mad Hatter, and of course, this is the Toasty Time podcast. I want to thank anyone watching for welcoming back to episode two. When today we're going to be covering the 2022 film that just came out a few weeks prior, the new Marvel film starring Jared Leto, Morbius. Now, a lot of people have had a lot of different opinions, I feel, about the film since it's come out. Majority of the reception that I've gotten has been relatively negative, and I will go right out on the front street by saying I did not like Morbius. I did not like Morbius. I My expectations for it going in internally were a little bit not low, but tailored. Tailored. I didn't necessarily expect it to be this grandiose thing, partially because I'm a little limited on the knowledge base of Michael Morbius and just generally the Morbius character. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate into the film being bad, but I do feel when you go into something and you lack a bit of knowledge on the source material, when it's a character that's a bit lesser known, it does lead you to really fall into the hands of the filmmaker and the writer. They really have to You have to trust them to make the set dressing. You have to really believe that they're going to put you in position to be able to absorb and contextualize what's going on and connect with the character. Part of that obviously goes down to the actor himself, but as a whole, when you're writing the framework, if you're writing a story about a superhero-esque character, a vigilante-esque character, you have to really make sure that you bring the audience in a proper contextual way so you can ensure that they're able to glom onto this character. And I will say that is not something I felt with this film. It Over a very ongoing series of points, the story really lost me. It took me out, and it took me out mostly because I wasn't I wasn't able to latch on to anything. Normally when you're watching a superhero-esque narrative, or any type of, let's just say, Marvel genre film, when it's an introductory film, you have to have something to latch on to. Take a general example of Iron Man. Obviously, two totally different films, different standards, aiming to do different things. But a lot of people going into Iron Man weren't really familiar with Iron Man. So knowing that Kevin Feige and Robert Downey Jr. and everybody involved that's leading the project has to do a necessary, subsequent job making sure that those who don't have the know-how on who this is can find something to endear themselves to this person. So I suppose we can go ahead and start with the narrative and what initial things happened that really took me out of why I wasn't necessarily in love with Morbius. So we're going to start out with the origin. We initially open up the film with child Michael Morbius. He is living at what appears to be some form of medical compound or medical facility that essentially is completely housed by doctors of various professions and children who seem to be suffering from varying medical ailments that seem to be on the more severe side. It's not a general hospice looking location. It's very much a facility that seems tailored towards dealing to disabilities. Now, Michael Morbius, as a child, has this very rare, specific blood disease that has handicapped him in a way. He doesn't have functioning use of his legs, so he walks using crutches. And the film opens up with him essentially in the hospital bed, and he's welcomed in by the person who essentially is going to end up becoming his best friend for his life, for the longevity of the film, and that is Nicholas. Now, Nicholas is another child who, similar to Michael Morbius, also deals with a handicap, but they endear to each other really well right off the bat. They're both somewhat awkward, which you expect from children as a whole, but awkward even so more if you're dealing with some form of a medical disability. Not that that makes you awkward, but just the treatment from the world. The opening scene actually shows the facility where they're staying is actually parallel from what appears to be some form of private school or just a school in general. Kids are in uniforms, and there's a scene where the children randomly just start pointing up at the window where Morbius is looking out, sitting next to Nicholas, and they're talking about themselves and just doing a base introduction. And they start, making fun of them in a very chastising and aggressive way. As kids are to do, because children are kind of shit sometimes. They don't know any better. But in the midst of that, they're kind of regaling and making fun of the two that they're stuck living within this facility, which obviously upsets Morbius and Nicholas. You can tell that it obviously stings them in a way internally. But even throughout that, they in the midst of bonding, they bond in the midst of being chastised, which happens often in those certain circumstances. The disenfranchised and the downtrodden do tend to band together in moments when they're being subjugated. So it's an open moment to make what would already be a fast friendship, because kids generally don't need much to be friends. So we jump forward. I believe the timestamp says about 20-25 plus years. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And we find ourselves at an award ceremony where we see an older adult Michael Morbius, Jared Leto, obviously at this point in the role, and he's sitting waiting to be presented by an award. He's essentially receiving this long introductory acceptance speech from one of his peers saying all of the great things that he's done to deserving of this Nobel Peace Prize. Essentially, in the time since then, Michael Morbius has gone to medical school. He's graduated with high honors. He's become a very recognized doctor within the medical field. And the current placing for what he's doing is he's actually created a form of artificial blood, which they say, in the midst of explaining it, has led to more lives saved than penicillin. Penicillin. So one of the things, I guess this is one of the opening things I have an issue with. It's tedious, but it's a problem. Whenever films have a habit where they're trying to write in, I guess, real world application achievements within the real world and using things like that, it kind of takes me out of it, because I'm like, Michael Morbius's artificial blood has saved more lives than penicillin. That's entirely possible. That's entirely possible. But I'm just immediately like, yeah. So in the midst of that, he's getting up to go accept his award, and the scene cuts immediately, and we jump to a hospital scene where Morbius is sitting in his uniform, and he's talking to a child, one of his patients, who's at a hospital, who also appears to be dealing with some form of medical ailment. And he's essentially giving her a play-by-play of the award ceremony, what happened, how things went, and what he was able to take away from it. Now, what we surmise and he kind of fills in is basically he declined the Nobel Prize and told off a bunch of people in the academy. And my first thought is why? One, why would you do that? Two, more importantly, why don't we get that scene? It's really weird that the first moment where I guess we're supposed to be establishing Morbius has a sense of, it's not even morality. It's I don't necessarily know how we look at that, because he doesn't really give the child much reasoning for why he did it, other than how I am and I don't do well with people type of thing, which is fine, because if you're trying to present the personality characteristic within Michael Morbius, that he generally is maybe a not so play by the rules type of guy. He doesn't necessarily feel that the governing bodies and awards should be presented to people. Maybe he feels just on a base level that he's here to help people, and that's the only thing that's important to him. We don't know, because again, we don't get the scene, but you just kind of got to guess and move along and take it for what you will with that. Now, I suppose the best transition from there is how we get from Dr. Michael Morbius to Morbius. So, apparently, and this is another scene that really doesn't get much introduction for how we get here. We're just kind of there. So, Morbius has apparently set up this expedition with a series of, may not henchmen, but just general guardians. And that feels weird to say. There's a group of people that he has hired to take an expedition to Costa Rica, and they're essentially going there because Michael Morbius is doing some experimental research, as he's apparently been doing for years, we find out later, into looking into cures for himself and for his best friend Nicholas, as a way to try to free them from the bounds of the blood pathogen disease that is ailing them. So they go to Costa Rica, And essentially, he's going there to try to capture a large quantity of these bats, vampire bats specifically, that are inhabiting this area. So they go to the scene and they go to this cave, and even the scene's weird. He essentially steps into this, it doesn't even necessarily look like a box, this archway, and essentially slices open his palm right in the middle, places it open in front of the gateway to the threshold to the cave, and attracts maybe 300 bats. They swarm him, they immediately go in, and we kind of just cut to the next scene where again we're just kind of somewhere else. The movie does that a lot at the introduction, where we have a lot of context that it feels like would be really useful to help you understand what's happening or how it's happening or how we got here, and they kind of just cut away from it and we're somewhere else. So we transition from there. Michael Morbius is back home in his laboratory with this series of bats, and he's beginning these experiments where this specifically is him trying to combine his human DNA with that of the bat DNA. His reason for this being is because apparently bats carry with them sort of a trait, a characteristic that allows them to consume blood, obviously, and that be the only thing that they require for nourishment. And essentially, with this, he feels that there hides a trait where if he can isolate that with his human DNA, he will be able to combat his blood disease and hopefully cure himself and his friend. Now, he goes through a series of trials where this fails repeatedly and essentially gets a bit frustrated. But eventually, he finds the correct ratio he needs between, I guess, the two DNA strands, and he finds a cure. Finds a cure with the assistance of a friend of his and also a fellow doctor who is, I guess you could label her as the romantic, yeah, the romantic interest in this. That is a Miss Martine. She's played by Aria Arano. And she's a female doctor within the same hospital sector that Michael Morbius works in. And while she initially finds out about how he's planning to try to cure himself with this idea, she's a bit against it. She contextually we absorb that she has some feelings for Morbius and ultimately she wants him to live. And so we come to find out that she's going to assist him with this. So the experiment and the trials that Morbius sets up, he has to apparently do on international waters off away from, United States soil, which makes sense from a legal standpoint, but also what he's doing is illegal as all fuck. So I really don't understand why he followed that specific guideline, but did it anyway. Weird. But so we transition out, and they're on this essentially this freighter that Morbius, the female Dr. Martine, and a slew of henchmen that they've hired as, I guess, guards, and the ones that are setting up probably own this freighter while they're housing it, trying to conduct the experiments. And after a series of trials, Morbius finds the correct ratio and locks himself within this area after he's taken the compound. And essentially, what we get, in addition to his handicap being completely cured, well, partially completely cured, is a transformation. Morbius ends up becoming the version of Morbius that the general viewership is more familiar with, the vampire Morbius, the blood sucking Morbius. He has essentially turned into a Dracula human hybrid, you would say. He has, in addition to his physical disabilities being cured, he has increased stamina and strength. He has advanced reaction reflexes. He's extremely fast now. And the next power, which is probably my least favorite that he has within this film, is this weird phase shifting Kurt Wagner X-Men Nightcrawler-esque transporting thing. It's like flash dashing, but like eclipsed in the shadow aura that they put around him. And they really oversaturate him in this aura all the time. At certain points in the beginning, when he first gets the powers, it's just happening when he's darting around or jumping around, doing quick movements. But then later on, it's happening all the time. And it's this really glossy, smeared effect that keeps going across the screen. It's really unappealing. And it kept taking me out of the action moments because they just drowned the action scenes in this effect. anytime he's doing anything, and you know it's a superhero film, so they're going to open it up with the initial montagey, but not montagey s showcase to kind of showcase what he can do. And he's, jumping across the city and he's darting in between buildings and hopping off of things, trying to get a general feel for what he can do. Kind of general Sam Raimi Spider-Man 1-esque, where he kind of just flipping through skyscrapers and woohoo into the sky and everything, except a lot more, Jared Leto-esque. So it's reserved and it's very, stoic, but at the same time, you can show that he's still trying to portray somebody, who's been disabled their entire life and now can move not only to a normal standpoint, but to an abnormal and, hyper standpoint. He can fly almost essentially. And we get to that in a certain point. It's flying, it's gliding, it's 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 not quite flying. It's not quite flying because he doesn't seem to be able to just leap to the sky Superman-esque at any point in time. Essentially, what the power feels like is it's like his body becomes weightless and he's kind of gliding off the airstream currents that are being produced around either fast moving winds or objects that are moving at a high speed. So there's a scene where he's in a subway underground, obviously, and he's in this combat scene, and a train essentially is coming by, and it's the first time that he figures out he can do this, and he kind of jumps up, and it's like an airstream starts being created by the train going by, because obviously, a subway car is going to be going quickly, but it's like this super speed airstream that kind of comes out of nowhere. And it's almost like he jumps onto the stream and proceeds to kind of power surf it as it goes by and can do that anywhere, I guess. That's a thing that, again, they don't do a good job giving you context for how this is or what this is. So when you're watching it, you don't know when it should be able to happen or when it shouldn't be able to happen. You don't know how grounded he should be, or you don't know if he should be able to just leap in the fucking sky and, take off like, goddamn Captain Marvel. So it creates this confusion where it's always a little bit harder to get immersed in a story when you aren't quite sure the rules of the world that you're watching. So after Morbius has had some time to dissect his powers and adventure out into the world, we jump back a scene because obviously the freighter where he originally was conducting these experiments gets found. Now, what we kind of glossed over is in the midst of that, when he first doses himself with the cure, Morbius loses control, and the, I suppose, antagonistic characteristic of his abilities is that they're not entirely in his control. He has this very, as you would assume, vampiristic lust for blood, and sometimes that overtakes his character and causes him to kill. And this first instance happens, he kills everyone on the freighter except for the doctor that is there assisting him, which amounts to, I believe, 8 or 9 people. So a bit later in the film, the freighter gets found and they find all these bodies on there and they have been completely drained of blood, which immediately creates this news frenzy because that's not something that happens very often, even in a world superhero-esque. And the universe is within the superhero universe, specifically the Spider-Man universe, but it's also like it's not. It's like it's there, but it's like it's not there. Because there are references and callbacks to things within the universe, especially at the end with an end credit scene that I'm also not very fond of. But at the same time, it's like they're trying to keep this isolated as possible, which I kind of want them to do because I don't want this touching Spider-Man. It's probably going to touch Spider-Man, and it's probably going to be Tom Holland years down the line whenever they figure this out. But I don't want it to. I don't like this character. I don't like the setup that they did. I think there's a good Morbius story in there somewhere, but I don't think that they portray it very well. So the police start looking for the person, because you start the assumption there as a cop, that ended up murdering all of these people. And that puts them on the trail of Michael Morbius. And the police officer in question that is leading the charge, kind of our leading man as the authority figure within this film, ironically, is Tyrese. It's Tyrese playing the role of Officer Simon Stroud. Now, Simon Stroud is I don't necessarily want to call him your typical cop figure, but that's kind of what he is. But that's more so the fault of what I feel that either the director told Tyrese not to do or that Tyrese decided to do. Simon Stroud as a character comes off very one dimensional. He's very much just the guy trying to figure out what's going on. And he has a very quippy and, you know, generally comical sidekick next to him. Agent Rodriguez is his partner. And he's kind of the one that's adding a bit of levity to the situation, even though the context of the film still seems to be trying to keep it dark. It had some parallels to Venom in it, but I feel what Venom did with what Venom was trying to do as Venom greatly overlaps what this was trying to do as Morbius trying to do maybe some Venom and maybe a few other things. So when Tyrese's character is introduced, he very much comes off just, we got to figure this out. What's going on? And who are these people and why is this happening? It's very much not the character you expect from Tyrese. And generally speaking, the immediate cinematic film familiarity with Tyrese is the Fast and Furious franchise. You know, that's where you've seen most of him recently. And he's usually, you know, very boisterous in that, very loud, very animated, very vocal, and very comic reliefy. And I didn't necessarily need that for this because he's a cop figure, remember. I'm perfectly fine with him being a bit more, you know, foreboding and a bit more assertive and a bit more serious. He's the main character trying to solve the mystery of what's going on in the city. I'm fine with him being a bit more on the ball about it. But what I feel that either the direction given to him, the actor, or the direction that Tyrese decided to take with the character, either just trying to take a more serious tone with this, or just trying to step away from maybe the general tone that people expect from him as an actor now. He kind of whitewashes the character a little bit. He makes him a little too bland, a little too one dimensional. And I almost feel like if he would have livened him up a little bit, I would have been able to attach onto him a little bit better. And he was a character because you see him so much tracking the steps of the plot of the film in this, that you would have liked him to be a little bit easier to connect on to. But at the same time, you know, that's what we end up getting. So you kind of just have to take that with a grain of salt. Now, in the midst of that, I suppose we ultimately have to lead into what sets up the conflict for this film. Because with that explanation provided, you probably think to yourself, okay, so the conflict is going to be the law chasing Morbius, but it's not. So after Morbius has had a bit of time to explore his powers, to run about the city, to get the law on his tail, and to ultimately figure out that these powers are not worth what he's gained and that he needs to try to find a way to reverse this. Remember Nicholas, his buddy from way back at the beginning? So one of the few character bites that you get about Nicholas is that Nicholas is actually very wealthy. We don't know how. I don't know how. We still don't know how. And when I'm watching the film at first, I convinced myself that maybe he had a family member that left him a great deal of money, but they were both in this medical facility for orphans. So I don't know where that comes into play at. Then later I started to try to make the assumption in my head that just like maybe Morpheus became a really successful doctor, maybe Nicholas became a successful something with money and he was funding him. He was apparently funding him in this research that he was looking into for the cure for them all these years. So he comes to see Morbius at one point after Morbius has cured himself, and he sees him, he sees his characteristics, and he's, you know, he's ecstatic, as you would be, because you assume now you're second up to get cured. Now, what Morbius ends up telling him, practically so, is that we have to find a way to fix this. These powers are wrong. I've changed. I'm not myself, and it's not worth the cost of what this is just to be back, you know, moving at general capacity. And Nicholas is distraught. He doesn't want to hear anything about that. He wants to be, you know, in Morbius's shoes. You know, he can jump and fly and do all these amazing things. And in a world where you've been limited to walking with crutches and dealing with a disability for presumably 20 late plus years of your life, you would probably move under a similar vein. You might be willing to take on the circumstances or whatever that cost may be. But Morbius refuses. and he doesn't want to see his friend walk down the dark path that he's forcibly had to stumble now, and he's honestly not even 100% certain he'll be able to cure himself. So he doesn't want to damn his friend to a fate that he's now suffering, which is understandable as well. And they could have, I feel, done a better job drumming up one, the relationship between these two. You very much get them in patches. The movie jumps too much for me, where I feel like this relationship is supposed to be the main one that we're supposed to glom onto, these two brothers, and we don't really get to see them bond much. You spend more time with Morbius and Martine, and Morbius just generally by himself out in the city than you do with him and Nicholas. And I think had the movie done a better job sticking those two together for a couple more extended scenes, you at least would be in a better position to feel closer to their relationship and then better about the rift that we're about to go into. So after Morbius refuses Nicholas, Nicholas leaves and he does not see him for some time. And we get a bit of news later on as he's checking in and the city is being aware that more bodies are starting to be found around the city, similar in the same vein as the capacity of the bodies that were found on the freighter that Morbius left behind. Now, when you're watching that, and what Morbius honestly starts to believe is that his powers are getting away from him, that he's starting to black out and go into these fits of rage and murderous content at points he can't remember, and he's killing people in the streets and he doesn't know what to do. Now, this is not the case. Morbius isn't killing anyone. We find, in fact, actually, that Nicholas, in the scene that he was in the hospital, in the laboratory with Morbius, he steals the cure. He steals the cure and essentially becomes the exact same type of being that Morbius is now, this hybrid-esque character with vampire characteristics. He can essentially do everything Morbius can, but he kind of can't at the same time, which again, we don't know why that is. Now, Morbius, presumably, as far as the time that the movie covers, is maybe a few days, at most, maybe a week ahead of Nicholas in regards to how his abilities were set in. But for some reason, it seems like he's more proficient. Now, obviously, the argument could be made after watching the film that he just took more time to practice at what he could do to figure it out. But in the time span that happens between that and then the final conflict, it just still feels like Morbius has powers that Nicholas doesn't. And maybe he does, but I don't know why that is. And I don't get explained that well enough to really get why I should be okay with that. So after some time passes and more bodies are filling up the streets, Morbius eventually comes to find out after meeting with him again that Nicholas took the cure. And Nicholas is very much power mad at this point, power drunk, I'm sorry. He is just so immersed in what he can now do and the fact that no one can stop him and no one should be able to stop him. He wants things to stay as they are. He wants Morbius to join him and he wants them to just go live their lives, go out into the world and conquer in whatever fashion they would want to. And if a few people have to die along the way, people are dying anyway. Morbius obviously being the moral compass of the two. And I don't essentially feel that Nicholas doesn't have a moral compass. He does not at all strike me as a vindictive person up until the point that he gets his abilities, where I feel that there should have been this brash jump to him immediately becoming a murderer. But at the same time, Morbius also kills like 10 people in this. And you can kind of take the argument that the power just eventually kind of corrupts his mind and he just can't help himself because he's so immersed in what he can now do. But Morbius tries to talk to Nicholas after he confronts him and finds out he has these abilities, tries to bring him back to the side of good, tries to get him to understand that we should not be this way. And even at the cost of us having to return to our life as it was before, it's better at the cost of people dying for the sake of us being able to move around better. And Nicholas doesn't agree. And this is where you get the understanding and the aha moment, which I suppose you can get later on, but maybe it was just the ambition and hopefulness of me in the film that we would have gotten somebody else for him to be in, wits with. It's Nicholas. And the rest of the film is this really awkward and hokey and unconvincing and anticlimactic clash between these two where they're just kind of chasing each other around the city and flipping over things and having these random heavy CGI cut battles where they'll start fist fights and then jump off of something and then both be moving in this weird monochromatic slow motion cut and all of a sudden they're moving fast again. It was the pacing for the fight was really, really bad, and it's just the fact that you're watching these 2 people of all people, and this is the climactic scene that you get for the ending. So, fast forward towards the apex of the film where they have this final showdown battle in this really open construction-esque area, and they're flying through things and, breaking through construction beams, and there's a lot of hand-to-hand slashing, but the fight just feels really weightless, and I think it's just ultimately the context of who's fighting. I think if you did a better job with 2 better characters, then the combat here would have been fine, and even though I don't generally love that splash effect that I mentioned with the Nightcrawler as transporting speed dashing that they're both doing, I do think that even that could have been digested a little bit better, but I just feel like it gets so stuck on this tone. It's just it shouldn't have been this. You should have found someone else to get the vampire powers with Morbius. And if someone with his same abilities has to fight him, which is generally how the origin movies start with these superhero movies, it's combating it's someone with some like type of abilities or like type of combat style as them, then I do think that you could have at least ended this better. But the fact that you're watching this film and for like what feels is 2 hours and 20 minutes, but I know it's really like an hour and 45. It's just this really weighted and unsatisfying thing of you're watching this guy, absorb these abilities and learn these things that he's able to do. And then when you get to the point where he's supposed to clash, it's just with his friend who's been dealing with the same type of disability as him his whole life. And he's basically just a carbon copy of him that's less appealing because the powers make him kind of a douche. And it's just I feel ultimately they could have done a better job writing a better film, and they could have definitely done a better job picking a better first antagonist for Morbius. Because granted, I don't know how many legs this is going to have. I don't know if we'll even end up revisiting this again with Jared Leto in this character. I know ultimately they have some long-term goals to do with the new version of Blade and a rendition of that, and some things with Spider-Man, the Tom Holland version later on. Even he's openly expressed some interest in the character since the film's been out and said that he'd be happy to do something with it. But I just, if this is the character, I don't know if I want this to mix and bleed over into the Marvel Spider-Man universe that I'm actually really content with at this point in time. So as far as Morbius goes, I just feel like it was a letdown because they did a very poor job framing his origin story. They really don't do much to endear you to him to make you want to glob onto him getting powers and coming to find out what that's supposed to mean. And they really, 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 really don't do a good job giving you a villain that you're supposed to be excited that he's combating with. So by the time you get to the end, even if you feel like the CGI and the presentation for what he can do is interesting, I personally would have a hard time believing that you were, really looking forward to seeing more of this. I mean, if you are, I've seen some people that are, you're not wrong for feeling that way, but I just I've seen movies try to do something like this better, and even Venom that wasn't even amazingly good or anything close to that, I feel does a better job trying to do what this film did. So Morbius, ultimately, I'll stick with it to see where it goes, but my hopes for it, if this is going to be the style in which they formulate his world, are ultimately very low. So I suppose to wrap up, we can transition into the two end credit scenes that we end up getting for this. One of which is excuse me, almost immediately a quick transitional post credit scene. The other happens about a minute or two afterwards. So the first post credit scene that we get is kind of parallel actually to the Spider-Man No Way Home ending, where we see those, cinematic purple flashes dart across the sky to ultimately signify that the multiverse has been ripped open and that something has transitioned through. And what we find out the transition through is actually the vulture from the Spider-Man universe, actually the Michael Keaton Vulture, and he comes in out of costume in his regular attire, and he gets transported into a prison cell. And he's looking around, he's patting himself, trying to figure out where he is, and he almost immediately puts two and two together and realizes he's not in his universe, which is something I don't know why he picks up that fast, but he gets it. So they immediately do this long transitional, well, it's not long, a short transitional news cut of basically announcing that an unnamed man has appeared in a prison and they don't have any information on how he got there, so he's immediately getting released. Which, first and foremost, bullshit. Bullshit. If you showed up, even within the realm of the superhero universe, matter of fact, especially within the realm of the superhero universe, out of nowhere in a jail cell with no information on who you are, they're definitely not letting you go just because they don't have record of you. As a matter of fact, they're probably going to detain you longer until they figure out who you are and how you got here. But he just gets to leave. They literally just walk him out of jail. And I'm like, all right. So he leaves and then, essentially is out looking into the world. And that's where you kind of see him piece together that he's realized he's not in his universe anymore. So that's kind of essentially the genesis of what the scene is. Cut. Credits roll for about a minute or two. Then we get the actual post credit scene, which is Michael Morbius, and he's driving a car going down some dark highway in what appears to be some desert area. Maybe he's in Vegas, maybe he's in, I don't know, California somewhere. It's really unclear. He's just driving. He could be on the outskirts of the city, but it looks very desert-esque and nowhere in New York or anywhere around that base looks like that I'm aware of anyway. So he's driving and he essentially pulls off into this clearing area and gets out of the car and then is confronted by the vulture again. Now, this time the vulture is in full costume. He's got the wings, he's got his helmet on, he's ready to go. But it's not the vulture in the style that we originally saw from the Spider-Man No Way Home universe, or excuse me, the Spider-Man MCU universe. It's a vulture that is actually wearing a costume, ironically enough, from the suit from the Amazing Spider-Man universe. The ending of the, or not ending, the tail end of the Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man 2, when they're going through that basement area and they kind of cut across all of the, famous Spider-Man villain costumes that are kind of in those casings and all the files. The Vulture costume they have in there is what he's wearing, ironically enough, which I kind of like, I guess, because in this universe, he'd ultimately maybe have a different suit that wasn't pieced together through, Chitauri tech that was salvaged from the first Avengers battle, like in the first Spider-Man movie, and maybe he pieced together with something different here. So I'm cool with that, and it looked fine even though the helmet is really CGI and the voice, the voicing that he has sounds really weird. It sounds like he recorded it through this really odd filter, like he was speaking directly into a cell phone as he was talking. But essentially, what he says is he confronts Morbius and he ultimately, surprisingly, tells Morbius that we should team up, that guys like us could ultimately do some good if we banded together. And Morbius, looking very intrigued, just because, yeah, sounds like a plan. And that's where it cuts. I don't know what that means for the future. Presumably, maybe that'll ultimately end up turning into a long-term Sinister Six they're trying to put together, even though they kind of technically already did that in the No Way Home thing, even though it wasn't exactly six, even though it was intended to be. But maybe that's a long-term plan they'll have for the second phase of his three films or whatever they're going to do with that in the future. So we'll get maybe Morbius and Vulture, and we got two villains on the board for what potentially end up being six. So I suppose we'll see what happens with that. But that is going to go ahead and close us out here. That has been my overall thoughts on the Morbius film. I don't break your neck to go see this. If you want to see it, I recommend seeing it, but I just walk into it with reasonable expectations. And if you really loved it, then more power to you. You're not at all wrong. I would love to hear more feedback on what wowed you about it. So I'm going to go ahead and get up out of here. That has been episode 2 of the Toasty Time podcast, and we will see you guys for episode 3, where we're going to be having our first guest onto the show. I'm not going to say who yet, but I think it's going to be something you guys are going to be really happy about. And we're going to be looking in on the movie premiering this Friday, Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore. So I will see you guys next time for that. And y'all stay toasty out there.